The sky above Vietnam was not blue. It was a wounded gray, heavy with smoke, with rain, with the weight of things that would not be forgotten. The helicopters came in waves, blades cutting through the damp air, their echoes rolling across the mountains like thunder that refused to fade. Below them, the jungle waited, a sea of green, endless and alive, shifting and breathing as though it knew what was coming. For the young men who crossed the ocean to meet it, this was the edge of the world. They arrived carrying everything they thought they needed: weapons, rations, orders, and courage too fragile to last. The first thing they learned was that the air itself was an enemy. It clung to their skin, thick with humidity and the smell of diesel and decay. Every breath was a reminder that they were far from home. When their boots sank into the red mud for the first time, the earth swallowed the sound like it was listening. The jungle did not welcome them, it studied them. Every leaf was a curtain, every vine a trap, every whisper of wind a voice too quiet to understand. Insects screamed from the trees, a sound that never stopped, a living pulse that replaced silence. Sweat came before fear did, and soon the two became the same thing. The days stretched, not in hours, but in survival. The sun was a merciless god, beating down until even the rivers seemed to steam. When it rained, the world disappeared into water. The downpour turned dirt into rivers and rivers into traps. The men learned to move carefully, to walk like ghosts through the green cathedral of the jungle. Each step was heavy, each breath a negotiation with the unseen. They had been told they were fighting a war, but what they found was something older and crueler. The jungle itself was a force, patient, cunning, eternal. It could hide an army beneath its leaves, swallow a tank in mud, silence the loudest scream. They soon learned that the enemy wasn't always a man. Sometimes it was a shadow, sometimes a sound, sometimes the feeling that eyes were watching from just beyond the trees. At night, the air changed. It grew thicker, heavier, as if the darkness itself pressed down. The stars were rarely visible. Instead, there was mist, glowing faintly under the pale light of a veiled moon. The forest came alive in whispers and movement. Branches cracked in the distance, water dripped from unseen heights, and every rustle carried the possibility of death. The men stopped believing in safety. Sleep became a luxury they could not afford. Some nights, flares would rise over the tree line, brief suns burning the mist into gold before vanishing again. The shadows would twist and dance, and for a moment, the jungle looked beautiful. Terrible, but beautiful. And then, when the light died, the fear returned, larger than before. The men would lie in the mud, gripping their rifles, their breath shallow, waiting for something they could not name. Morning never brought relief, only visibility. The world around them was green and wet and endless. They walked through it in silence, faces streaked with dirt and sweat. Somewhere ahead, the war waited, not in clear lines or battlefields, but hidden in the whisper of bamboo and the glint of metal in the leaves. Villages appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Some were silent, empty, but not abandoned. Others were filled with faces, old men, women, children, eyes too tired to show fear. The soldiers moved through them cautiously, unsure of what they saw. Every smile might hide a trap, every house might conceal a rifle. They left behind the smell of smoke and the sound of engines fading into distance. Time lost meaning. Days melted into one another until even memory began to rot. They marked it not by dates, but by losses. A man who didn't return from patrol, a sound that became an explosion, a familiar voice that vanished mid-sentence. In the jungle, things disappeared. Not just people, but pieces of who they were. Each man carried something from home close to his chest. A photograph, a letter, a token of a world that still made sense. They would take them out when the rain stopped, hold them in shaking hands, and stare as though the images could breathe warmth back into their bones. But even those faces, smiling from another world, began to fade beneath the layers of dirt and despair. And still they marched, through swamps that swallowed boots whole, through fields of tall grass that moved with hidden life, through forests where sunlight never reached the ground. The air was thick with rot and the stench of war. Helicopters thundered overhead, their shadows slicing across the land like blades. Sometimes they brought supplies, sometimes they carried the wounded. Sometimes they lifted away bodies wrapped in tarps, disappearing into the clouds as though erasing proof that men had ever been there. The jungle gave nothing freely. Every inch of ground was taken twice, once by force and once by loss. The soldiers moved as one, a silent procession of mud-streaked faces and hollow eyes. They had come as boys, but the jungle was sculpting them into something else, something that no one back home would recognize. They were learning that war was not the clash of armies or the sound of victory. It was the quiet between gunfire, the waiting, the endless waiting. The jungle waited, patient as time itself. Every tree seemed to lean closer, listening. The soldiers moved through it like intruders in a sacred place, disturbing an order older than any war. The air smelled of wet earth and rot, of things dying and growing all at once. When they stopped to rest, the silence was so deep it felt like a sound. And in that silence they began to understand. The jungle was not their enemy, not entirely. It was something else, a presence that did not care who lived or died. The ground was never still. Leeches clung to skin, worms surfaced in the rain, and roots tangled around their boots like veins. The men moved cautiously, afraid to disturb the land beneath them. The smell of gunpowder mingled with life, a reminder that both could coexist in the same breath. The first ambush came like inevitability. One moment they were walking through tall grass, the next the air erupted. Gunfire tore through the trees, bullets spraying in invisible arcs. Men fell, swallowed by mud and foliage. Smoke and heat rose, and the jungle seemed to watch, unchanged, indifferent. Then silence returned, always silence. They carried the wounded out through mud and blood, medics working with trembling hands, whispering words that sounded like prayers. Helicopters roared overhead, lifting away bodies wrapped in tarps, leaving the living to reckon with the quiet. The rain fell harder in the days that followed, pounding leaves and helmets, washing the battlefield into rivers. The men moved with haunted precision, every step measured, every sound suspect. Their faces changed, innocence gone, replaced by a quiet, heavy awareness. At night, they gathered in small circles, cigarettes glowing in the mist. They didn't speak. Each man carried his own ghosts. The jungle carried the rest. Time lost meaning. Days melted into one another until memory itself began to rot. They marked it not by dates, but by losses. A man who didn't return from patrol. A sound that became an explosion. A familiar voice vanished mid-sentence. In the jungle, not only people disappeared, but pieces of themselves. Each man carried something from home. A photograph, a letter, a token of a world that still made sense. They would hold it in their hands during the rain, trying to summon warmth from an image. But even those memories began to fade beneath layers of mud and despair. And still they marched, through swamps, through forests where sunlight never reached the ground. The air was thick with rot and the stench of war. Helicopters thundered above, shadows slicing across the land. Sometimes they brought supplies, sometimes the wounded, sometimes only carried away proof that men had been there. The jungle gave nothing freely. Every inch was taken twice, once by force, once by loss. The soldiers moved as one, a procession of mud-streaked faces and hollow eyes. They had come as boys, but the jungle was shaping them into something else, something unrecognizable. The war was not battles or victories. It was the quiet between gunfire, the waiting, the endless, patient waiting. The rain became a rhythm that marked their lives, pounding against leaves, helmets, and the mud beneath their boots. It was constant, cleansing, and cruel, hiding them from sight while blurring the world, making it hard to tell what was real and what was memory. The jungle grew denser. Sunlight, a rumor, filtered through a canopy of green. Uniforms clung like second skin, soaked in sweat and fear. They had forgotten quiet. Even when no one moved, the jungle spoke. Insects, frogs, distant cries, an orchestra of life and death. The men learned to listen. A sudden silence signaled danger, and often that danger was already there. Weeks became months. Maps meant little. The land shifted beneath their feet. Trails disappeared beneath fallen trees. Rivers carved new paths overnight. They relied on instinct, on the rhythm of the march, on the feel of the ground. The compass spun under the magnetic pull of the earth. The jungle had its own direction. They were only passing through. The soldiers changed. Fear dulled, replaced by a strange, quiet calm. They moved with the rhythm of the land, slow, deliberate, quiet. The jungle had taught them its ways. The new arrivals were easy to spot. Uniforms clean, eyes wide. They still believed in the war, in purpose. The veterans barely looked at them. Belief would not last. The jungle would strip it away, leaving only survival. Bodies were no longer shocking, only arithmetic. Death arrived, taken by the rain, covered by mud, reclaimed by nature. The men adapted. Maps, orders, morality. These were words that belonged to another world. In rare moments, light pierced the canopy. Dawn cut through mist, turning leaves to emerald glass. Rivers shimmered, carrying fragments of war downstream. A helmet, a boot, a spent bullet. Beauty and horror merged. They were inseparable. Each man carried the war inside. It settled deep and heavy. Where fear once lived, courage and terror vanished, leaving endurance. They marched through an eternal world, untouched by human logic. The jungle did not kill them all. It changed them. It stripped certainty, identity, and the sense that life was fragile or precious. Out here, life simply was. Relentless, indifferent, unstoppable. The men became mirrors of that truth. Yet, within the numbness, something human remained. Small acts of care, a whispered prayer, a photograph tucked carefully into a pocket. These were the last signs of who they had been. The jungle took the rest, and as it did, the men realized the true battle was not against an enemy they could not see, but against the land itself. And the part of themselves, the land, had awakened. The jungle had become their world, their prison, their teacher. It whispered lessons no one wanted to learn. Out here, everything was alive and everything was dying all at once. The men had stopped asking when they would go home. Home had turned into a distant abstraction, a place that no longer belonged to them. They lived by instinct now, half men, half ghosts, shaped by the breathing wilderness that surrounded them. Everywhere they went, the land remembered their passing. Trails of footprints that filled with rain, empty shell casings half buried in the dirt, the faint smell of smoke clinging to the leaves. The jungle absorbed it all without judgment, without remorse. What the men destroyed, nature reclaimed. What they buried, the earth swallowed whole. The rhythm of war was no longer loud. It was quiet, constant, steady. A heartbeat that pulsed through the roots of the trees and the veins of the men. They had adapted to the waiting, to the endless cycle of tension and release. Ambushes came and went like sudden storms. Death arrived as part of the landscape, swift and impersonal. No one screamed anymore. Even pain had lost its edge. Sometimes, after a firefight, they would stand in silence, surrounded by smoke and ruin. The jungle never stopped breathing. The rain would come, soft at first, then heavy, washing the ash from the leaves. The bodies sank into mud. The world reset itself as if nothing had happened, and in that moment, the men realized how small they truly were. Nights grew longer. The moon hid behind clouds thick as smoke. The forest glowed faintly under the mist, shapes shifting in the dark. Sleep became a dangerous thing, too deep, and the jungle might take you. Too light, and exhaustion would. Some men began to wander during the night, drawn by unseen calls. They walked into the trees and did not return. Others claimed to have seen them later, their outlines flickering between the branches, faces pale and expressionless, like reflections in water. The line between life and death blurred until it vanished. Out here, existence was a rumor. The men began to move like phantoms, their steps soundless, their eyes hollow. They no longer spoke of survival. They simply continued. There were moments of strange, haunting beauty, the way dawn painted the canopy in shades of gold and green, the way the mist rose from the ground like spirits escaping the soil, the way the rivers shimmered in the dim light, carrying fragments of the war downstream, a helmet, a torn boot, the glint of a bullet casing. Beauty and horror became indistinguishable. They belonged to the same breath. Each man carried the war inside him. It settled behind the ribs, deep and heavy, where fear used to be. They no longer felt courage or terror, only endurance. They marched through a world that seemed eternal, untouched by the logic of men. The jungle, in its quiet wisdom, taught them something that no general ever could. That war was not about winning or losing. It was about surviving long enough to understand that survival itself was its own kind of surrender. As the months dragged into years, the faces around them changed. The bright-eyed boys who had arrived with ideals were gone. In their place stood men carved from silence and instinct. Their skin was marked by the sun, their eyes dulled by repetition. They had become part of the scenery, living extensions of the land they once feared. The world beyond the jungle felt imaginary. The sounds of laughter, of cars, of waves, they belonged to another lifetime. Here, the soundtrack was rain, insects, and distant thunder. Time was measured not by clocks, but by the beating of helicopter blades above the canopy, by the brief moments when light touched the earth before being swallowed again. Then one day, the orders came. It was over, they were told. The war that had defined them, that had stripped them bare, that had consumed every breath and heartbeat, was ending. But the jungle didn't seem to notice. It continued as it always had, alive, ancient, infinite. The men packed their gear in silence, their movements slow, uncertain. They had dreamed of this moment once, but now it felt wrong, unfinished. Leaving was not escape, it was abandonment of the only world that still made sense. When the helicopters came for them, the sound filled the sky, deafening, familiar. As they lifted off, the wind from the rotors bent the treetops, scattering leaves and dust into the air. Below, the jungle stretched out endlessly, green and unbroken, as if swallowing every trace of what had happened. From above, the war looked small, a ripple on the vast surface of the earth. The men stared down through the open doors, their faces blank. They watched the land that had shaped them fade beneath the clouds. Some felt relief. Others felt nothing. Most simply stared, unable to decide if they were leaving a place or if it was leaving them. The noise of the rotors filled their heads, and yet beneath it, they could still hear the jungle's breath. Even from thousands of feet above, it was there, a sound that lived in their bones now, impossible to escape. When they reached home, the silence was unbearable. Streets too quiet, skies too blue, air too clean. People smiled, asked questions, used words like hero and sacrifice. But the soldiers did not have answers. The language of home no longer matched the rhythm of their thoughts. They had learned to live in whispers, in rain, in the hum of unseen life. At night, they heard the jungle again, not in dreams, in memory. The whine of insects behind closed eyes, the sudden crack of branches, the smell of wet earth, the sound of rain on metal rooftops that felt like gunfire. Some woke gasping, reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. Others simply lay still, listening to the silence until it became unbearable. Time moved on, but the war did not. It lived quietly in their minds, in the hollow between heartbeats, in the spaces where peace should have been. Some tried to forget, others tried to remember. None succeeded. Years later, when they looked back, the memories came not as stories, but as fragments, flashes of green and red, the taste of mud, the hum of distant engines, the faces of friends long gone, the way the jungle had smelled before the rain, the way the air had felt before the ambush, the way the world had seemed alive with something that could never be named. And somewhere, far across the ocean, the jungle continued. It grew over the scars left behind, covering craters, swallowing metal, reclaiming what was once taken. The trees rose again, their roots pushing through forgotten helmets, their branches reaching toward the same gray sky. The land healed, but not completely. The ghosts remained, quiet, invisible, part of the air. Those who returned would sometimes hear it, the sound of wind moving through the trees, the faint echo of helicopter blades in the distance, a sound that could belong to memory or to something more, because some echoes never fade. And in Vietnam, when the wind is right and the rain falls just so, it still sounds like the whisper of helicopters, a ghostly rhythm carried through time. The war is gone, but the jungle still breathes, and in its breath, the echo remains.